Hi, HRN listeners. We're celebrating our 15th anniversary, and we have a really fun campaign and an ask for you. This 15th anniversary tour is aiming to bring you closer to unique food and music experiences in some of the most exciting cities in America. All the while, we're raising funds to support our work empowering the next generation of food systems storytellers through our fellowship programs. Here's how it works. Donate to HRN and be entered into a raffle in the city of your choice to win a dinner for two at a noteworthy restaurant and tickets for two to a concert at a prominent local venue. We have incredible partners in New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Nashville, Las Vegas, Charleston, Asheville, and Ardmore, Pennsylvania, who have donated a meal for two and two tickets to a concert of the winner's choice. And all donations help fund our fellowship programs, where we're helping to build essential workforce readiness skills and food system storytelling skills. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15. Thank you.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. With more than 30 weekly podcasts, HRN has something for every food lover. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
This episode is brought to you by Roberta's, home of Heritage Radio Network for 10 years. Learn more about Roberta's at robertaspizza.com.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host on Beer Sessions Radio, and it's Tuesday, August 9th, 2022. We're recording remotely with friends from all around the world today. We're going to talk a little bit about yeast, but some of the history and traditions with bread and beer. And of course, we're going in way over my head, and we're all going to learn something from it. So let's go around the room and introduce each other. I'm Jimmy, so let's ask Lars.
My name is Lars Marius Garshol. I'm from Norway. I'm a researcher in yeast and traditional farmhouse brewing.
And we had Lars on a couple years ago talking about his book, The Historic Brewing Techniques. And Pete?
Yep. Pete Lingel Fushimi, craft brewer based out of New York City.
And Pete's one of our go-to expert brewer scientists for many shows. It's great to have you back. And Eric?
Hi there, Eric Pallant. I'm in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and I'm the author of a recent book called Sourdough Culture. It's a book about the history of sourdough yeast and bacteria and baking.
Great. Well, thank you guys all for joining. So, Pete, it's great to have you back on. It's funny, it was just a couple of years ago that you were the first brewer to tell me about the Kveik yeast. But bring us up to date. Like, what was it about Kveik? It kind of like took everyone by storm. You know, what were people brewing with Kveik a couple of years ago?
I think originally I was attracted to it, and probably most brewers, by its extreme high temperature tolerance, and at the same time, as a result of that, the speed at which it fermented beers. This is like most yeast strains, or the standard yeast strain that craft brewers have been using since the 70s, is like US-05 Cal Ale yeast, the yeast that Sierra Nevada uses, and that ferments, to give you an idea, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And Kveik, and if you ferment that much higher, even into like mid-70s, it'll start producing some terrible off-character called fusel alcohols that make the beer undrinkable and give you a terrible hangover. So you have to really tightly regulate that temperature around 68 Fahrenheit. And then this strain of Kveik, actually there's multiple ones, but this yeast that suddenly appeared on the market out of, I guess, Lars will tell us, but Norway probably originally. There's this huge buzz about this yeast strain that ferments happily at 85 and above and does not produce these fusel alcohols. So it's kind of insane compared to what people were used to as far as yeast wrangling goes, and the speed at which it ferments. It's like done in a couple days. So it kind of revolutionized tank time in craft brewing, and tank time that's your tank residence time is how long your beer is in fermentation, and that is the big bottleneck for craft brewers, your fermentation, how many fermenters you have and how long the beers are in there. And I could just keep going down a rabbit hole here, but
you will. We're going a whole hour, but
we'll
that little bit kind of started us. We got to meet Lars, and his book came out, and we had a great show 2 years ago. And I noticed that Lars mentioned that he's been following. It's almost like a death watch of the last of these traditional brewers in these little regions in Norway where they each have their own kveik. And I wanted Lars to tell us a little bit about that, because we think about all these, there's seed savers and genetic diversity and like you said, Pete, this kveik, the Kveik yeast that you guys started using, enabled you to brew faster and hotter and all that. So there's definitely like this. We know what Lars is doing, but let's talk about it. Let's talk about the fear of losing the keepers of the kveik.
Yeah. So this yeast comes from people who homebrew beer according to ancient traditions, basically in their own villages. So when they brew the way that they learned from their parents, who again learned it from their grandparents and so on. And together with the knowledge of how to brew, a lot of them also got a culture of yeast that when you put the yeast into one beer, it multiplies. So after you brewed, you have more yeast than when you started. And what they do is they just harvest it and keep it until the next beer. And you can keep repitching it essentially for many centuries. And that's what these people have been doing. But this type of brewing has become quite unfashionable and seen as, a relic from the old days, basically. So a lot of these brewers are quite advanced in age. And as you noticed, Jimmy, one of them, Dagfinn Vendelbo, he died earlier this summer. And every time that happens, there is one brewer less, and there is one person less to keep these cultures and this whole tradition going. And it's really an issue. I'm working on a new book, and I've been calling people in different regions in Norway to try and see how many people are still brewing. And I was looking into my notes for a remote county called Oppdal, just to see people I'd heard rumors about that they were brewing. And I look up the first name and just type them into Google to try and find them. And the first search hit is their death notice. So I go to my notes and I search for the second person, and don't you know it, the first hit is the death notice again. So I searched for the third person, and there's a newspaper article saying he was brewing 2 years ago. I find his phone number, I interview him, and he says he's the last person in the village to be brewing, which is, in Oppdal, people have been brewing their own beer for, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, 4,000 years. And now there's one family left. So in the case of this Dagfinn Vendelbo, who was also a keeper of yeast, I did get an email from his son just before this weekend saying that he wasn't actually a brewer before, but he had decided to start brewing because he wanted to maintain the tradition. So that was really encouraging.
Yeah, no, it's great what you've been talking about, and we're going to dive deeper in the show. And let's get Eric on. So the reason I invited Eric on is that I read your book, Sourdough Culture, and you had some really great stories about sourdough, and there's a lot of overlap with brewing. So it's beer and bread, and these magic stories of like going back to Jesus and the multiplying of the loaves. So let's just tell us the premise of your book, Eric, and this gold mine sourdough starter you found that went back to the 19th century.
Yeah, so that's how I got started. Is So my yeast are wild yeast, and they're also infected with bacteria. So I've got maybe a dozen species of yeast and a dozen species of bacteria. So my primary yeast is the same one that you're using in beer, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. But one day I'd been making bread for 20, 25 years, and my teenage kids who were capable of eating a loaf a day by themselves, I realized, my starter is older than my kids. And I was wondering, like, well, how old is this starter really? And I screwed up my courage, and I like Kveik, it was a culture, both in the microbial sense of the word, but also a culture of bread making that can be handed from one person to another. And so it may be true that the old brewers are dying off, but the technique can live for another 4,000 years. And the family of yeasts in Norway could, if we just give them one person to the next. Anyway, I called the person from whom I got my starter and asked, do you remember me? 25 years ago, you gave me a starter. And they said, oh, yes. And they told me who gave them the starter. And I started tracing it back. And the farthest I could trace back with any reliability was from the gold rush of Cripple Creek, Colorado in 1893, which means I had this living menagerie zoo of little microscopic organisms that nobody's ever actually seen, although that's not totally true. I do have a scanning electron microscope picture of my bacterial yeast, of which I'm very proud. I have it hanging on my refrigerator. But even 1893 is like, well, how did the culture get to the top of the Rocky Mountains? And so I felt compelled to go all the way back to the beginning and figure out who invented bread, who first domesticated yeast to make beer and bread. And that ultimately becomes a book that Jimmy Carboni reads and calls me up and says, hey, do you want to be on the show?
Yeah. One anecdote, just from those whatever thousands of years ago, what were a couple examples of the early domestication of yeast for bread?
Well, right. So this is, I get asked a lot. Okay, so when do we know for sure that people are making sourdough bread or making beer? And it turns out, as Peter says, beer we know a little bit more about. The ancient Egyptians, for sure, and probably the ancient Sumerians, were making beer with wild yeast and wild bacteria. So it would have been one of those wild beers with all kinds of funky flavors in it, which I'm actually quite partial to, but again, I'm a sourdough baker. And so rather than selecting for just one yeast, whatever falls into your vat, that's what you're going to be growing. But we now have the techniques where we can get the scrapings from the inside of a beer vat that was in ancient Egypt and cultivate those yeasts and ostensibly make a beer that would have been had 4,000 or 5,000, 6,000 years ago. And the question is, was sourdough bread being made at the same time? Are you using the same yeast and you're just using a little less liquid and a little bit more grain and to make bread? And the problem is that you don't know for sure that the yeast and bacteria are in there, because you're going to cook that bread at 500 degrees Fahrenheit or something, and all those little yeast cells are going to blow up and not be found again. Whereas the scrapings, the crud on the inside of a beer vat, you can sort of select and recultivate again. And I can tell a Jesus story if you want, Jimmy, or we can save it for later. So
let's get the Jesus story in. So there's a lot of highlights in your book.
Yeah. So I, for those of you who remember Jesus, he among his last words, at the Last Supper, Jesus says to his followers, he says essentially, I am the product of fermentation. He says, my body is bread, which at that time could only have been sourdough bread, and my blood is wine. And there is something, all of us listening to this know that there's more to that statement than my body is bread and my blood is wine. There's a spiritual transformation that takes place if you let grapes or barley malt or something like that, and some liquid and some yeast go to town. You're going to end up with a transformation, a transubstantiation from grape juice to wine. That's going to be a kind of spiritual or magical or something that's going to happen here that we can't really explain with earthly terms. And the same is true with bread. And I like to think of this story that in some ways Jesus was saying, not only like a sourdough starter, can you share my body with your neighbors by giving them a sample, literally, of your sourdough starter. That would have been known to everybody at the time. But if we think about the cycles of wheat growing in the fields of the Fertile Crescent is a living organism, which we take the life of, we kill that wheat by harvesting it, and then we grind it into a flour, and then infect it with sourdough culture, which brings it back to life, sort of like Jesus, who comes back to life. And then we bake it, which unfortunately kills all the yeast and bacteria all over again, to become this magical substance, this change from dough to bread, which then brings us sustenance and life. Even though it has died in the oven, it brings us life. So it is this, there's so much to that statement when Jesus says, my body is bread and my blood is wine. He's saying this is this cycle of transformation, of transubstantiation, of this life-giving substance that, as Lars said at the very beginning, essentially can live forever. Right? That's what Jesus is saying. Is
Wow. It is amazing that you've both are onto this idea of these, perpetuating, yeasts and things. And Lars, let's let our listeners hear more about your first book and just a little bit how you first started, investigating Kveik and these traditional yeasts and brewing traditions.
Yeah, so in my case, it started with I was interested in beer and trying different kinds of beer and seeing what I would like. And I heard these stories about there being something strange in Lithuania. So I went there and had a few of the beers, and they were just they blew my mind. Not just because they were good, but also because I couldn't tell what they were. I'd spent 10 years learning about beer at that point, and I just had absolutely no idea what was going on in these beers, where they came from, or why they were like that. And it wasn't very easy to find out more. So in the first beer bar, like halfway through the first beer, I just went back to the bartender who recommended it and tried to ask her, like, why does the beer taste like this? Is it the hops or? And she looks at me and she says, what is hops? And I'm like, oh, this isn't going to work. But eventually what I worked out was that in Lithuania, they still had this tradition of people brewing beer on the farms like they always had, according to traditions that had absolutely nothing to do with modern beer. And when I realized that, the next thing I realized was that I'd heard about this sort of thing in Norway too. And then when I tried to look into that, we pretty quickly started hearing stories about this Kveik yeast. And so me and the Canadian beer journalist spent basically 9 months putting together an expedition through rural Norway. So the trouble is these people are brewing for themselves, for their family and their neighbors. So they're not selling the beer, and so there's no public registry. They don't have any businesses. There's no advertising. You really need to find, people who are doing this in their own cellars for themselves. So that was really hard. But then when we went there and we saw what they were doing, it was It was mind-blowing in several ways. So one thing was this fact that they had their own yeast that they just inherited from their ancestors, and they just kept it going themselves. And according to the textbooks, that should be wild yeast, and you should be getting sour beer. But it wasn't like that at all. It was obviously domesticated yeast. They were producing excellent non-sour beer. It wasn't funky at all. And of course, it had all these amazing properties. And then we learned that other brewers were doing a lot of stuff that the textbooks say, oh, you can't do that. But they'd never read the textbooks. They didn't know that. They just did what their parents did, and of course it worked.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the beginning. And then I came back, and I was like, but all of these people are doing different things, and how many other insane things are there to discover here? And the end result was the book, basically.
Yeah. And then, like, for Pete, for you with a science background, I mean, how can you explain that this yeast, the Kveik yeast, could operate faster and at a higher temperature? I mean, is there that much variation with the different yeasts that you brew with?
There is, and I'm just assuming that was maybe they were brewing in the summertime when it was quite hot, obviously without any temperature control, and then they were selecting by tasting the beer, and through selection of this made a good beer and this made a better beer and this made a better beer, they kind of selected for a strain that did not produce fusel alcohols at high temperature. But even beyond that, I'm not sure why it's so high, because that's compared to, obviously that same process went on everywhere else in the world, but somehow in Norway they got this strain that's very high temperature fermentation and produces nice clean beer.
I guess I should add that this thing about fermenting at body temperature, so 100 Fahrenheit, that's not special to Norway. Farmhouse brewers were doing that in the UK, in Russia, in the Baltics, pretty much everywhere. And it seems that all of these, well, not all, nearly all of these yeasts that they have been using, at least the ones that we've found, because I've collected yeast from Russia and Lithuania and Latvia as well. Those all have this ability to handle high temperatures, and it's genetically, it's a mechanism that the yeast is using that sort of exists in normal yeast as well, but it's not as fully developed. So basically, the yeast is using a sugar that's called trehalose that covers the inside and the outside of the cell wall and sort of protects it against the heat. This is something that insects, for example, use to survive freezing in winter as well.
I'm wondering how we ended up with these, common strains at this point in history that have the reverse. Maybe it's the opposite of that process, where when refrigeration developed, we sort of selected for cold fermenting yeast, and that's aside from lager yeast.
That's been my theory, actually, that's what happened, and commercial brewers had a way to cool the beer before fermentation. And so for them, it made sense to ferment cold so that the lactic acid bacteria couldn't turn the beer sour as easily. Whereas people brewing on farms, they were brewing, 150 liters. Don't know what that is in gallons, but it's big, like a bathtub, and in big, thick wooden vessels. So for them to cool the beer down until you can pitch the yeast, that takes a long time. And they've been brewing all day. They want to go to bed. They really want to get the yeast in. And they also know that the longer you wait before you put the yeast in, the more time you give the bacteria to get started. So I think that sort of pushed commercial brewers and farmhouse brewers in opposite directions.
Yeah, and I'm wondering how this, these Kveik strains manage to stay clean, as far as not having a mixed culture of bacteria and other wild yeast, especially with the way that they were stored.
They were often dried between use. So then, once you've dried it, nothing happens. There's nothing growing there anymore. So you sort of freeze it until you put it back in the next beer. And if you think about the environment that this is happening in. So you're pitching the yeast into, sugary liquid, which is a gold mine for all sorts of microorganisms. They just love this. It's just full of energy. Very quickly, what happens is you put in a lot of yeast, right? And if there is some contamination, it's going to be just a few cells by comparison. And then the yeast goes to work and it starts eating all the simple sugars. It pumps out a lot of alcohol that nobody else likes, removes all the oxygen that the other organisms need, and it lowers the pH. It makes it really, really hard for anybody else to survive in there. So I think that's really the answer.
But there are many organisms, as we call the beer spoilers, and you could ask any lambic brewer, there's the passing of the baton, even in that environment of low pH and high alcohol content. So it's interesting to me how they were relatively clean. Like there was no pure.
Well, if you look at the lambic fermentation,
mixed.
There's been studies of lambic fermentation, right, where you don't add any yeast, you just put the wort into a barrel, and there's some stuff living in the wood, and it comes out and it ferments what's in there. But if you look at those studies, you see that in the beginning of fermentation, it's totally dominated by beer yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and all the other guys start growing later. And the farmhouse brewers, they would remove their yeast after 24 hours. So they weren't giving the other guys time to grow.
And then, Lars, are they inoculating very large quantities of yeast?
No,
too?
They're not.
It varies. Some would put in quite a lot, and some would put in very little.
And it doesn't make any difference, does it?
It doesn't seem to, but I think you have to realize that even, let's say you are putting in very little, which means like
with all that sugar ready to go, they reproduce so quickly it doesn't make that big a difference in the outcome. Yeah.
But you're starting from very different starting points, though. So what you're putting in of yeast, if you're putting in very little into 150 liters, you're maybe putting in something like how to say this, like a slice of bread, the same volume.
Yeah.
And any contamination that you got in there is going to be a lot smaller. And Saccharomyces cerevisiae is really good at growing fast. Of course, it doesn't always win. Sometimes this goes bad and it goes sour, but then they throw it away.
Or wait, or they keep it and wait.
No, they usually they have in the old days, every single farm would have yeast, right? So if it really went sour and you didn't have any more of your yeast, you would go to the neighbor and you would get good yeast. But the thing is, you every time that you brew, afterwards you have more yeast than you started with. So it's not really very difficult to keep more yeast than you need, so that you have a backup if you need it.
So Pete is kind of right. He was saying that there's a selection process that has occurred with the long tradition of the Kveiks. Lars?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's tempting to say, like he suggested, that the yeast adapted to the way that the farmhouse brewers are using it. But we don't know for sure whether they adapted their brewing to the yeast that they had, however they got it, or whether the yeast adapted to their way of brewing. So for the fast fermentation, for example, it looks like probably the yeast adapted to the way that they're using it because they're harvesting it so early. But for this response to heat, the use of trehalose and all of those genes, we don't really know. It's perfectly possible that it adapted, but you can't look at the genes and say, yes, it adapted. You just know, where it ended up, but not how it got there.
Yeah. Well, it is amazing that the Kveik has become something that commercial brewers are using. Just to talk about a couple beer styles, I read that you're going to a Lithuanian raw ale festival. What is Lithuanian raw ale?
So in modern brewing, the way you brew is typically you mix hot water and the malts, you get sugar out. That's called wort. Then you boil the wort for an hour and you cool and you ferment. And raw ale is when you skip the boil, which is one of those things that the textbooks say that you can't do that. It's going to lead to several types of problems, including sour beer, because by boiling, you kill all the bacteria. But historically, until just a few centuries ago, kettles were super expensive. Most people didn't have them. In fact, even just 150 years ago, Norwegian farmers were using copper kettles as status objects to show how rich they were, which sounds absurd today, but I assure you it's true. So, and then when you don't have a kettle, boiling the beer for an hour is going to be really hard. So historically, people didn't do that. And this is kind of like, imagine you're making tomato soup, right? The recipe always says to boil the soup. Well, imagine if you just skip that. It's going to taste different, right? And that's the case for these beers as well. They just have very different flavors from normal beer. And most professional brewers, the first time they hear about it, they think, oh my God, this is going to be horrible. But to continue the tomato soup metaphor, Spanish gazpacho is never boiled. It's perfectly edible. It doesn't taste like normal tomato soup, but it's perfectly edible. And it's the same way with this. It's a different kind of beer.
Yeah, just one of many interesting questions we have for you today. I'm going to go back to Eric and back to his book. Eric, jumping ahead from ancient times to the 19th century, you had a really fascinating section in your book about industrialization, and I know you got to go and study. You're a scholar. What was it? What was your Fulbright award or something?
Right.
And you were studying development of the cotton textile industry. So just tell us like the overlaps between the industrialization of yeast for bread and how that can relate to beer as well.
Well, it took a great deal of restraint right at the outset. Peter pointed out that one of the great benefits to craft brewers of Kveik yeast is that it works at higher temperatures, and any microbe that works at a higher temperature is going to be much quicker at what it does, and that essentially that way of thinking turned out to be the pathway toward the destruction of bread that I would consider worth eating. And so what happens is you have, it starts really in the 1600s with Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who's the first one who ever looks at a microscopic organism, and is the first person to ever see yeast, but he doesn't know what they are, right? He says these are yeast, but he doesn't know if they're animals or vegetables or minerals or chemical compounds, and it's going to take 200 years of experimentation across Europe for scientists to finally conclude when Louis Pasteur says, you know what, yeast are biological organisms. They do fermentation. They consume sugars, as everything that Lars was describing. They excrete carbon dioxide and alcohol. But at that same time, in the 19th century, you have this ability to now start to isolate yeast from other microscopic organisms that people don't like the outcomes from. So all of these things that make sour beers are really, turns out, go out of fashion, I would say, as much as anything else. Carlsberg, who's Danish, not Norwegian, is the first person to ever isolate sort of a single species of yeast and use it for fermentation and for making beer. And so that's sort of a fun fact that also that being Scandinavian and being Danish, he was like, well, sure, anybody wants to borrow this yeast can have some, just come to my lab and I'll show you how I isolated it and you can have some and take it home. hard to imagine, an American entrepreneur or scientist, not patenting right away his new discovery. The problem is, though, once you have yeast, that you can start to really select for its speed rather than its ability to make flavor. You end up with a bread yeast that is essentially genetically selected to be super powerful, right? So if you go to the store and buy Fleischmann's yeast or Red Ball, or whatever, Red Star yeast or something like that, and put that into a bread, what happens an hour later? It will rise, guarantee it will rise in an hour. And then it becomes the only food I know that you have to punch before you do anything with, right? You actually have to punch it down once or twice. It's so vigorous, but to me, it's a symbol of kind of profit coming before flavor, which is the goal in making a Wonder Bread or a commercial bread is speed and reproducibility and strength and all that. And so there's a little bit of pause I have. Like Kveik, I love the idea of maintaining a culture in both sense of the word that are thousands of years old and a collection of yeast that can really only be found in this farmhouse or this set of farmhouses or something like that. But I worry that if gets into the wrong hands, essentially into corporate hands, right? You can imagine Anheuser-Busch figuring out how to brew beer even faster. That speed here equals a way to make more money rather than to maintain the tradition that is designed to be somewhat slow. And so I guess in that regard, maybe beer and bread diverge a little bit, which is a key ingredient to bread making is time, is that slower is better. Whereas beer, waiting 3-4 weeks for a beer to finish fermenting is a long time to wait. And I suppose that's one reason I like making bread is like, if it doesn't come out well, I've only lost a day or two. If I'm making beer and it doesn't come out well, I've lost a month and 5 gallons at the very least.
Eric, in your book, you really did follow the story of this sourdough starter. And, when you talked about the industrialization, you were talking about some interesting processes of washing yeast and pulling the early days of the commercial yeast of how it was made from brewer's yeast or from beer.
Right.
Shed some light on that, because you really did a lot. Your book is very well researched, so there's a lot of history that I'd never heard of before.
Right, and Jimmy just makes sure sometime at the end to make sure that most people, when they hear very well researched, think, "Oh my God, I'm not going to read that book." It's well researched, but I hope it's also a good read, in that it's kind of a mystery of how did we maintain a culture for 6,000 years and lose it all, between 1850 and 1950, and it is that process of how pure can we make yeast, how well can we wash and strain out all the other microscopic organisms. The first step is that you have to be able to see them and recognize that they're not something religious or magical that just comes from taking a handful of this foam that was on the beer, or that was, right? Because it's the same thing. And what I like about talking to brewers is that they recognize that beer is liquid bread and vice versa. And so I do have a question for you, Lars, before I go too far, which is, does anybody try making bread from the yeast that are found in Norway, these Kveik yeasts?
Yeah, people have done that. In fact, some of the farmhouse brewers have done that, and they say it works really well. I like what you were saying about the properties of bread yeast earlier, because they are very similar to the properties of Kveik yeast for whatever reason. I'm not sure why.
In what regard?
Well, speed of fermentation, ability to handle high temperature, and also ability to handle high alcohol. So it's remarkably similar.
Right, and I like what you were saying, which is that I think of it as a kind of a co-evolution or a co-adaptation, which is that these the Kveik yeast survive only because these Norwegian farmers keep them alive. But the opposite is also true. In some ways, these yeasts have kept these farmers alive, right? It made sure that they had, at the very least, a liquid that wasn't contaminated with anything else. So that there was a pure. I mean, this is the history of beer, right? Which is that it makes sure no other bacteria that might do you harm.
Yeah,
It provides a sort of source of nutrition and vitamins that you can't get any other way. And so you don't buy that?
that's a huge subject, but Norway is so far north, basically, that people didn't have enough grain that they could drink beer all year. So in fact, Norwegians relied on, for most of the year, a weird drink made from the sour leftovers of cheese making mixed with water. And so being able to drink beer once or twice a year was a huge event for the traditional Norwegians.
And then what are they using for grain? Are they using rye, or are they using wheat or barley, or?
Predominantly it was barley, and so the consequence of that was that traditional Norwegian bread, for the most part, was not leavened. It was made from, or it was made into these wafer thin, crisp things. So they baked actually once a year, and they kept these stacks for the rest of the year. So even in southeastern Norway, the total wheat harvest for 1 year might be 2 barrels for one parish.
Right, which doesn't surprise me. And so that turns out to be the history of bread making is very closely tied to the limits, the geographic limits of where wheat can grow.
Yeah,
and wheat is a pretty finicky crop, which is it likes just the right amount of water and just the right amount of temperature. And if it gets either too cold or too damp, you're going to have to grow oats and barley and rye, which is why the sustenance foods in Scotland are oat cakes, and in Germany and Denmark and Norway, it's rye breads. And if you really have to, then you go to barley crackers. But I will tell you that in my research, the ancient Romans who made essentially imported wheat from in order to make sourdough bread. They imported wheat from North Africa, from the Middle East and Egypt. But their real breadbasket of ancient Rome was Ukraine, which is still the world's wheat basket. And they considered barley bread and barley crackers to be fit only for pigs and prisoners, is how they described it. And I guess Norwegians.
That's what they thought of our beer as well, right? So they called us barbarians, and then they have a drink made from rotted barley, one Roman source writes.
Wow.
Yeah, right. And did they like it?
Well, in the UK, the Roman army had lots of breweries and so on. So the elite in Rome probably didn't like it.
Right. And I love this, though, but if you look at a map of the UK where Hadrian's Wall separates England from Scotland, Hadrian's Wall is ostensibly put up to keep those vicious Scottish warriors from, climbing down onto, the Roman occupiers. It's also exactly the line at which wheat no longer grows. North of Hadrian's Wall, there is no wheat, and the Romans refused to eat bread that was made from anything other than wheat, or drink beer made from anything other than the yeast and wheat that they were accustomed to. So I always think of Hadrian's Wall as to keep the oats out,
the wheat wall.
It's probably a great conversation.
It's probably also a limit where suddenly population density goes dramatically down, and so politically controlling that area is going to be a lot harder, probably. So it makes sense in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and population goes down because wheat is a far more nutritious crop. It gives you so much more protein per acre, per hectare than barley or oats will. And so you're right. Yeah. I love doing that kind of history of, okay, why are these things here? And there's a political reason, and then it's all about food, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Lars, hold on. We're off to a great start. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a few minutes on Beer Sessions Radio. All right.
This episode is brought to you by Roberta's, home of Heritage Radio Network for 10 years. Roberta's was founded in Bushwick in 2008 and has become one of the most iconic restaurants in the country. HRN made its home inside of Roberta's in 2009, and together they have become part of the DIY fabric of the neighborhood. Roberta's, the pizza restaurant, is open for lunch and dinner 7 days a week and serves much more than just the famous wood-fired pizzas. Their team dreams up new salads, pastas, and sandwiches on the regular. Roberta's Tiki Bar is alive and well in the back garden, serving up frozen drinks in the summer and hot toddies in the winter. Stop by the bakery and takeout spot next door for fresh breads, sticky buns, and pizzas to go. And of course, there's the 2 Michelin-starred Blanca tucked away in the garden for truly daring diners. But Roberta's also extends beyond Bushwick, with multiple locations in New York City and now in Los Angeles. You can also find their frozen pies in grocery stores around the country. The spirit of Roberta's, like Heritage Radio Network, is everywhere. Here's to many more years of pizza-powered radio. Learn more about Roberta's at robertaspizza.com.
Hey, welcome back to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. Support us and become a member at heritageradionetwork.org/donate. There's over 30 podcasts every week, food, farming, chefs, cocktails, and beer on Heritage Radio Network. All right, so Lars and Eric, both authors, were talking about history of sourdough starters and Kveik yeast. And Pete, we want to get you back in because you've got your little scientist brain here.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Eric, well, first of all, have you ever had a beer made with a sourdough starter? But secondly, do you know, is there like a symbiotic relationship going on between the Saccharomyces and the Lactobacillus? Like, how does this mixed culture stay a mixed culture as it gets passed between bread and bread maker?
So I'll answer the first question first, which is no, I have never had a beer made with a sourdough starter.
I'm sure it's been done.
I'm sure it has. I have had sour beers, which of course very, very similar, and I have made bread with harvested brewer's yeast. Which,
how was that?
Well, it was interesting. So I went to my master brewer and I said, okay. This is how they did this for hundreds and hundreds of years, is they made bread with brewer's yeast. It was sort of before cookbooks, so nobody has a recipe for how much yeast you need. But in the end, what was interesting to me is it made my bread rise. I'm always sort of astonished that it works exactly the way you would expect it to. If you give yeast some sugars to eat, they will do what they do and generate carbon dioxide, and the bread will rise. So it did exactly what it should have done. But compared to sourdough bread, it was, in my opinion, monotonic. It only had one flavor, which is what bread made from only commercial yeast has. It doesn't have the acids that are generated by lactobacillus. So to get to your other question, it is very, very symbiotic. Yes, and that the yeast and bacteria break down sugars one for the other, and the yeast are tolerant of a certain pH that the lactobacillus will drop the solution to a pH of 5 or 6, but the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, as you know, will survive under those conditions. And so that part, they are very well adapted one to the other. The question is, and I spent a considerable amount of time trying to investigate this, does provenance matter? Is it like a wine where if you have a sourdough starter like I have 3 different ones, but if I have one from 1893 and I have a Russian rye starter, it came from a rye bread factory in Russia in 1960, like, does the age of this thing matter? And if I have a Kveik yeast that's 4,000 years old or like a 400 years old, is that any different than if I started with creating a new Kveik yeast tomorrow? Would it taste any different? And the jury is sort of out on that. Nobody really knows about whether these populations are stable over time or whether they change over time. And it's because we can't afford to do the experiment, right? To do the experiment, I'd have to take my starter and I'd have to give it to one to Jimmy and one to Lars and one to Peter. And Peter takes his to New York City and Lars takes his to Norway, and the conditions change. And we say, do the species inside here change? In a day, in a week, in a year, in 5 years, or something like that, and that just gets to be prohibitively expensive. And so, no, we can't even answer the question because it's just too hard an experiment to run. And I love that fact that we can't know the answer, and so it remains sort of mysterious. What does transfer when Lars gives me a Kveik yeast from Norway, if I make it the way the old timers do, is the story. The story travels with the culture, and that the story is as old as the person who's given it to you and to whom you're going to give it, and that really can't be broken.
No, that's great. Lars, let me ask, you mentioned Dogfin. Just tell us about another of your keepers of the Kveik, just to show us there's a range of different yeasts, different regions.
Right. So what we found is that we've managed to locate something like 40 different people in Western Norway that all maintain their own cultures. And then when you look at those genetically, it turns out they're all the same type of yeast. They're not the same, but genetically they're much more closer to each other than to anything else. And then if you look at Norway on the map, you need a good map for this. You'll see that it's divided by a mountain chain running north-south. So there's a west of the mountains and there's a east of the mountains. And it turns out that the people east of the mountains, they have a different type of yeast. It's related to Kveik, but it's not the same. It's genetically, it's noticeably different. So I was talking earlier today to a man named Sverre Skrindo. So he lives high up in one of the valleys in eastern Norway, really close to where the valley ends in the mountains. And he learned to brew from his father, but he's not actually the keeper of the yeast because for some reason his mother ended up with that job. So he would always do the brewing, and then she would be keeping the yeast dried on pieces of cloth in a plastic box in the house. And so it was her job to take out a piece of cloth, figure out which one smelled the best, and then cut off a piece of it. And then Sverre would bring her some of the unfermented beer, and she would be heating it on the stove top. This wasn't an induction stove. It was the old-fashioned kind where you have a sort of stone-like thing that gets heated by electricity from below. So to not heat it too much, she would put a trivet made of spun metal thread that would lift the saucer with the unfermented beer roughly a centimeter off the plate, and then make it grow in there. And then once it was time for once Sverre was finished making the unfermented beer, she would bring this and they would pour it in. And unfortunately, she died this summer as well. But Sverre is still brewing. but he has to keep his own yeast now.
It's amazing, all these stories.
Lars, I have a question for you. Is there anybody who, there's a fellow in Belgium, for example, who's got a so-called library of sourdough cultures from around the world. Is there anybody who's sort of capturing and preserving any of these sort of very local yeasts?
Yeah, so that was almost the first thing that I did. So before I went to meet the first people I ever met who had Kveik, I got in touch with the National Collection of Yeast Cultures in the UK.
That was my next question.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I asked them if they could keep it. They were very interested. So I've been sending them quite a lot of the cultures. Unfortunately, there's something called the Nagoya Protocol has been introduced. It's very, very careful about preserving local populations' ownership rights in their local microorganisms, which is a great thing. But it means that now NCYC requires signatures and paperwork to take on a new culture, and not everyone is willing to sign away their rights to the culture, which means I can't get NCYC to keep it. I've been trying to also send to other labs that only do research, and that's been relatively successful. And now, more recently, there's a government-funded project in Western Norway to set up a yeast bank to also keep yeast there.
Which makes sense. Doesn't Norway also have the global seed bank?
Yeah, we do actually. Yeah, it makes sense to keep these things where they came from, right? So the trouble is, will this have funding for the next 150 years? But I try to make as many copies as possible. I mean, that's the best safeguard, right?
No, exactly. I do the same as I give sourdough cultures to as many people as possible, so that if I lose it, I can get it back. But it goes back to Peter's question: when I get it back, is it the same or not? And we don't know, other than I can say that the story is true. That this is the starter from X that went to this other person, and it's now come back to me if need be. But I hear you, Lars. What we really want to do is preserve the tradition.
Yes.
Because it's so important, and because it tastes good, right? We wouldn't do it if it tasted terrible.
Yeah, that's the other thing that really this has brought home to me. That the reason this survived is that these people are making beer that are not like any beer that you can buy, and that's a huge part of why it's important to them and why they invest so much time in keeping it alive.
Yeah. Hey, let's talk about taste and flavors. So, Lars, you'd mentioned, let's talk about some of the farmhouse ales that you've tasted. You mentioned a Voss style farmhouse ale. Tell us a little bit about that and what it actually tastes like.
Yeah, so I was lucky that earlier this summer, Ivar Geitung from Voss dropped by my house and gave me like a 5-liter can of his farmhouse ale. So the thing that is traditional or that is characteristic of that specific style is you use a lot of juniper branches to add flavor to the beer. And also they boil it for many hours, like they boil away half the beer. And that gives the beer a lot of caramel flavor. So this beer that he's given me he says he thinks it's about 10%, which is probably right. I've got it in my glass now. It's quite sweet, and at the same time it has this fruity bitterness from the juniper branches and the caramel, obviously. And then his Kveik has done something strange. It adds flavors kind of like cognac and maybe cherry. It's really unusual. But he's a super good brewer, so all of these flavors really blend well together. It's
And what temperature do you drink the farmhouse ale at?
you're supposed to get them from the cellar. But people would then leave them in the main, the living room for a good while and just serve them out of a big bowl there. So, 10 to 15 degrees would be perfectly normal.
Wow. And Eric, for you, for sourdough, give us a recipe. You do in your book Sourdough Culture. You do. I love some of your historical breads. I like the New England brown bread. Is there a bread style or recipe you want to give a shout out to from your book?
The New England brown bread is it turned out to be a people's favorite. My absolute favorite is whatever is freshly out of the oven and still a little bit warm, and I don't really care what it is. And I think the shout out I want to give is that bread really only takes 4 ingredients. It really only takes flour, water, a little bit of salt, and you don't really need the salt, but if you don't remember to put it in, it doesn't taste very good. And a leavening, which is a sourdough culture. And what is true of beer is true of bread, which is like every valley has its own tradition about what the ratio of flour to water is, or how much time to give something, or whether I should braid it or put a hole in the middle, or and those traditions vary not just valley to valley, but country to country, and they take on a kind of significance that I would say those two things. Let's bring it back to Jesus, right? Which is there's a kind of significance to these fermented products that will bring people with the aroma back to a home, a sense of home and a home country that almost nothing else can do, right? Which is I can make a rye bread here in Western Pennsylvania and give it to a German immigrant and bring them to tears. As they think, oh my goodness, this is the taste of home. And so bread, and I suspect beer is very much the same, something that just really speaks to our hearts as well as our stomachs.
And Eric, about flavors and things in your bread, there is one section you seem to like things like seeds, and you've got this childlike joy when you get a really good loaf of bread. What is it about seeds in your bread?
The real, I'll be honest, the real childlike joy I get is from playing with my food with my hands. And it's something you stop doing when you're a child, and you don't get a chance to do again until you stick your hands into dough and get covered with flour and water and glop. And there's something joyful about that. And then something just miraculous about that transformation of dough coming out of an oven as bread. And seeds is just personal taste. There's nothing special about them, really.
And then last with Pete. Pete, what are you drinking? I mean, you're great history home brewer. Many of my favorite beers you've made and make. Are you brewing anything with the Kveik these days?
Yeah, we've brought in the. We attempted some, kind of fakey lagers with the Osfog, but it didn't quite work out. That's supposed to be the very clean, non-estery bike, and it's producing a lot more character than a lager yeast would. But what I'm drinking is a pure lager right now. It's a 3470 American Pilsner it's actually an adjunct lager with corn and some German hops, and it's delicious.
So Peter, can I ask you, how do you get a Kveik in New York?
Pretty much all of the commercial yeast labs have it now, and it's probably through Lars originally, and they're banking them too, but not all the ones that the ones that he's found from individuals. I don't know where these. Lars, where did they get these, do you think?
Well, I listened. I listened to Eric talking earlier about the possible development of Kveik yeast with some misgivings, because I did give all these yeast labs these yeasts. I sent it to them in the hope of making more copies and preserving it. And of course, what happened was exactly what Eric described. People thought, yeah, so people use these for traditional beers. That's super interesting. Let's use it to make IPA that's fermented really fast. Yeah, that's my fault, but that's what happened.
Yeah, we're adapting them to, craft beer, not sacrificing quality though.
No, they don't. That's true.
Well, you guys, we scratched the surface of going pretty deep into something that we haven't talked too much about is yeast. And Pete, you're always my go-to for anything science related in beer. I just want to thank you guys all for joining me. I think we've covered everything that I can handle right now because I'm getting my notebooks out. And another time, I really want to know from you guys how the hell sourdough starters and Kveik yeast survived the 19th and 20th centuries. I think I got that from Eric's book. That's the last one. Who wants to take a stab at that? How did sourdough, everything about food traditions, how did any of these survive the 19th and 20th century with all the industrialization of food and beer? Eric?
Well, I'll take a first stab, but I'm gonna use Lars's answer, which is it sort of hides in remote valleys, far away from civilization, until some hipster in Brooklyn discovers it again. You really had to have it sort of some old tradition far away. Is what kept sourdough culture alive at all, and I think farmhouse ales is sort of the same way.
Well, that's good. All right, guys. So one more time, we'll go around the room. Lars, thank you so much. Pete and Eric for joining me here on Heritage Radio Network. Big shout out to Armin Spingen, our engineer. And I'm Jimmy Carboni. We'll catch you next time on Beer Sessions Radio. All right. Thank you, guys. Beer Sessions Radio is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.